Good day, everyone. My name is Brenda Gunn. I am the Academic and Research Director at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. I'm Red River Métis, currently located in Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Red River Métis. I'm so pleased to be here today with Sheila Stewart. Sheila is a longtime Northern educator and dedicated facilitator for the Yellowknife Education District 1. As the dedicated facilitator, she organizes cultural camps, invites elders into schools, supports teachers in indigenizing education, and brings in vast amounts of local resources. Hi, Sheila, welcome. So this week, students are engaging in learning about the history and legacy of residential schools, including learning about Indigenous peoples' cultures and languages, and the importance of stories and their role in reconciliation in Canada. And so today, we're going to talk a bit more about Indigenous languages. Can you start by telling us a little bit more about your background and the work that you do? Oh, I think you're muted, Sheila.
There we go. So I live in Yellowknife, and it is on Treaty 8 land, the Dragies territory. And in the Northwest Territories, we have 11 official languages, 9 of them being Indigenous. So in Treaty 8 territory here in Yellowknife, we teach the Willowday dialect of the Fincho language.
Ah, excellent. Thank you. So as an educator, you've been involved for a long time in teaching Indigenous languages. Can you maybe tell us from your perspective, why is it important to learn Indigenous languages in schools?
Well, I think it's important not only to learn it in schools, but outside of schools in the homes, because it will only increase the pride people would have in who they are and where they come from. And it would also instill some traditional knowledge. And just, I think the most important part, though, is to make them feel like they're valued as Indigenous people.
Ah, yeah, I love that idea, that value. Maybe you can explain a little bit more for some of our audience about the ideas of how learning knowledge might convey some traditional knowledge.
Well, you mean their traditional skills, learning their traditional skills?
Sure, part of that, or just even what's all encompassed in some of the language itself, the ways of thinking or understanding.
Yeah, within the language is usually things are embedded that are easier understood in the language than it is to try and convey through English, because English tends to be fairly long-winded. And in Indigenous languages, one single word could convey a whole concept of doing and of being.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting to hear. So how do you engage in teaching Indigenous languages in schools or supporting? Yeah, we'll start with schools. What is some of the work that you've been involved in teaching in schools?
Well, within the schools, we teach the language through, it's all oral, spoken, and so it's through repetitive, where I would say a phrase and then the kids, I do an action and the children would try to figure out what I was saying, or introducing myself. My name is Sheila, what is your name? And so that's what our instructors are, how they teach it. And they also teach it through doing things, doing traditional things like cutting up fish and learning phrases through that, or sewing little projects, or listening to stories outside. So there's many ways that the children do it. Might be going for a nature walk, identifying plants, which we just did a culture camp on that last week. And then the next one would be identifying birds. So that's how the kids are getting the language.
So there's a large practical aspect to learning the language then.
Very much so, yes.
Ah, interesting. So I also just wanted to remind our audience out there that you're welcome to ask some questions to Sheila as well. I will continue to pepper her with the questions that I have prepared and the things that I'm interested in learning about. But if there's questions that you have, please feel free to put them in the chat function, and we'll try to get to those today as well. So a lot of the teachers and a lot of the classrooms that are joining us today may not have a lot of experience in teaching Indigenous languages or speaking Indigenous languages. Do you have any ideas on how some of the classrooms today could begin the process of maybe including Indigenous languages in the classroom?
I could start including it by maybe labeling some of the things in their classroom, or asking someone local who speaks the language to come in and talk to them and to teach them how to introduce themselves, or help them label things within the school. What we've started doing is for our bird camps or any of the camps, we just put a group of vocabulary together and we put a QR code attached to it. So the teacher can just read the QR code and they will be able to hear the sounds. And we have those now in place in all our schools. So if someone is learning birds, grade ones are learning birds, then we put those QR codes in all the schools, and the teachers, educational assistants can go up and just tap on those and hear the language.
Oh, wow. That's a great use of technology. And so who developed these resources? Is this part of your role then with the?
No, well, it is part of mine, but it's Andrea Harding, who happens to be right here, is the creator of our QR codes.
Excellent. Well, this sounds like an amazing resource. I love the idea of really connecting language to practical everyday activities, right? That my experience when I've tried to learn a language, it's hard if you're just reading it in books and using it, in small periods of time. So that ways to find, ways to include language in everyday, from small ways of learning to introduce yourselves and labeling things, and then building skills from there. I'm wondering if you can maybe share some of your ideas on, the connection between teaching and learning Indigenous languages today in school, and maybe how that helps us address the legacy of residential schools.
I think no matter what you're teaching, whether it's language or math or science, that it needs to be fun for the students. So let's take a game they know and then start, maybe it's Crazy Eights, and they play it, but they play it in English, and you write down all their phrases. And then so the phrases, then you start to teach them phrases in their language that they're learning. And then so next time they go to play, they've learned a few phrases. You may pass your cards to the right, or pass your cards to the left. Make it fun. Make it so that they can make mistakes and it can be funny. And we learn through our mistakes. So we hope that when we teach the language, that they're having fun doing it, that they're laughing and they're laughing at their mistakes. Everything's more joyful then.
That is that for me has always been the hardest part of learning any new language is that fear of making a mistake and being very self-conscious. So I like that advice about, trying to have fun with it and learn from the mistakes and laugh about it. That can be really challenging, especially with new languages where there may be new sounds and, ways of, speaking that we're not used to in the language that we speak. One of the questions that we have coming in is, how many Indigenous languages are there in Canada? And I don't know if you know the exact number, but maybe we can even come back to something you said at the beginning, which is that idea you said you're teaching Clicho. And you said about a dialect. Can you maybe even explain the idea of what is a dialect?
Well, a dialect would be from a language group, but just slightly, sounds might be slightly different, or you have two languages that have combined and made their own language. Now, I don't know, I guess another one that would be like that, it would be Michif, which is, I think, to me, I think it's two languages that are joined together. And that's what the Willowday dialect is. It's the Tlincho and the Dene Sosline. And it's a group of people that intermarried. And they formed their own little community, and then they had their own little language that they spoke. Yet the Tlincho people understand them when they speak. They just say, oh, in our area, we don't say it that way. We say it this way. And the same with when they go to the community next to them that speaks Dene Sosline, they can communicate because their languages are intertwined.
Okay, so even when we try to come up with the number of how many Indigenous languages across Canada, there might be different variations of that language in different regions. So the number is going to be really quite large across the country. We just had a question come in, and I really like the question. They're asking what language you speak at home.
I speak English at home.
Okay. Do you find ways that you're able to use your languages at home, or do you use it mostly at the work with at the schools, or?
Well, I'm one of those students that went to school speaking an Indigenous language and then come out the other end at grade 12 and don't speak any language don't speak an Indigenous language except English. So I too am learning. So I have different apps on my phone, one being a Cree app and one is a Dene Sosine, that I use with my grandchildren when they're over. So if we want to learn how to say a certain word, we go into that app and we find it and we practice it that way.
Oh, excellent. So yeah, another question coming in is how to learn the language, because you're right, through the process of residential schools and day schools and other schools that existed, many Indigenous peoples aren't learning languages or had those forcibly removed through the schooling process. So there's a lot of work now for many people to learn their languages. You've mentioned the idea of using language apps to learn some words. Are there other ways that you've tried to engage in processes of learning your language, or how you might recommend others to learn the language?
Yeah, I usually will call my friends who are fluent in a couple of Dene languages and ask them how to say a phrase or spell something. I also listen to Indigenous language programming on our local radio stations so that I can pick up the sounds. And then I try to distinguish which language that might be North Slavey or South Slavey or Tlincho or Gwich'in. So I listen to the radio stations a lot.
Oh, so even if you don't understand all of the words that are being said necessarily, there's still value and lessons you can learn by listening to the language and having it around you.
Yeah, and I also have a lady who works out of my office that's a fluent Quechua speaker. So if I would listen to a story on the radio and then I'd say, are they talking about this? And then she would clarify that and say yes or no, or I misinterpreted something. So I'm trying to get the phrases together to see if I can make sense of their stories.
Yeah, lots of different ways there, and the ability to have speakers around you to help you in that process is wonderful to have that in the workplace. So one of the questions coming in is how old Indigenous languages are. So how long has Dene Clecho been around?
Well, how long has English been around? How long have people had a voice? You know, that's how old languages are. Our languages, though, are just like English. They're ever evolving. We have to find new words for new things like computers or hearing aids, or even words for things like bananas, because we didn't have bananas here. They don't grow naturally in the Northwest Territories. So your language has to evolve with new things that come into your life. So even though it's a very old language, it is also still very much new.
That's a really important point. I think this idea of how languages continue to evolve to be modern languages, even when they are as old as the people who've been around a long time. Sheila, we've had a question go in. I don't know if you're comfortable answering it or not, but because this week is again Truth and Reconciliation Week, where students are learning about residential schools, someone was asking whether or not you attended a residential school.
I did attend residential school. I was there for 4 years. My first year I was there was the end of grade 1. So the second year I went, I was in grade 2. So yeah, I was there for 4 years, almost 5.
Okay, and that would be potentially the age of some of our audience today.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. Oh, here's another question coming in. I'm enjoying these questions so some of the students are asking, how many students do you teach? So how many students are attending the schools and the programs that you support? Do you have a general sense?
I don't know, over 2,000 students. So I visit schools every 3 days a week. Every other week I'm at a different school. And when I visit the schools, they give me a little schedule, like this one here I have. And it has the teacher's name, it has the topic they want to discuss, and it tells me how they're going to support me. So that most of this week when I visit schools, it's all on truth and reconciliation. So the students will send me questions, and before I go to class, I will prepare those answers for them. And then we might have a little story and maybe a little craft to do. But I visit, this particular school I showed you a schedule is only junior kindergarten to grade 5, and they're French immersion. It's a new school. It's called École Inclo, which means cranberry school. But when we started a new language program there, the students not only get French at that school, but they get Willeday too. So yeah, I'm on average, I see at least 1,200 students a week.
Oh, wow. That's a lot of students you connect with. And so the students, most of them who you'd be teaching, they would be speaking now English as a first language? and learning the Indigenous language as a second language or third in the case of the French school?
Most classes are in English here, except, yeah, all classes are taught in English, and 3 schools get Willa Day language classes like they do get core French in most places, except for in our enclosed school, they have French immersion. So yeah, we're trying to get the languages into all of our schools. Oh, I apologize. We've had great success with our high school Willa Day class. We have had it in there for 4 years now, and our high school students are becoming emergent speakers.
Oh, wow. So how long were they taking the classes then? Were they starting when they were young children or?
No, they just started 4 years ago at the high school. So some of the students had graduated. So the ones that are starting the first time this year over there would have had core Wheelie Day instruction at one of the schools. Then they go to high school and they have nothing to offer them because they haven't been in French. So we offer them Wheelie Day there also. And the style of instruction is really working for the students in grasping the language. So it's a great success.
Yeah, maybe you can speak a little bit more. How are they infusing language in throughout the school in order to have that amount of success of speakers coming out after 4 years?
Well, it has to do with the strategies that they use, and I'm not very familiar with it. It's they used to call it intensive French modeling, but I think it's some neurological something now. I can't remember the acronym for it. But so once again, it's just the teacher constantly speaking the language and the kids listening and trying to pick it up, and the teacher acting out. Like, I'm thirsty, I'm gonna go get a drink of water, and they're practicing those kinds of things. And so, and the kids are having fun doing it. The students love it. There's a lot of action in the classroom. There's no just sitting down and listening. They're moving, they're laughing, having fun learning the language, making fun of each other in a good way, of course.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah, that need to really be immersed in the language and speaking it regularly must be so important. Another question that has just come in is, why are there so many Indigenous languages?
Well, it's like, I don't know, why are there so many? That is a good question, but that's because we're not all the same. Every one of us from a different tribe, we're all different. So because we're different and we have different lifestyles and we've not lived together at all, we have our own languages to live with. So, and in the Northwest Territories, we may have 9 Indigenous languages, but 3 of them, or maybe even Wichin, 4 of them are pretty similar, and the 5 others are also very similar. So someone who speaks, like my friend speaks Slavey, she can go into another Indigenous community that speaks a totally different language and still understand them because the base of their language is the same. It's almost like dialect changes, but we hear their distinct languages.
Yeah, so as many different Indigenous peoples as there are in Canada, there would be many different languages, right?
Yep, exactly.
So we're almost out of time here today, but I wanted to come to this idea of the importance of, learning Indigenous language as our work on truth and reconciliation in Canada. We know that one of the goals of residential schools was, of course, to not allow languages to be spoken, and so to take away Indigenous people's culture. So do you have any closing thoughts on the role that Indigenous languages can play in supporting reconciliation in Canada?
Well, it's like I said earlier, that if you can speak your own language, that is something to be very proud of. And along with pride, is going to make us stronger. We're going to become stronger people because we're going to know who we are. We're going to know where we come from. And our languages tell us that too. Depending on where you come from, you speak a specific language. But I think learning the language will instill pride for our young people. And we lack that right now. They need to feel proud of who they are. And I think through the languages we can, and that we can teach everybody else too.
That's right. Yeah, the programs and the schools that you go to teach the Indigenous kids and the non-Indigenous kids
Yes.
languages. I think we have maybe 1 or 2 more minutes before we wrap up. Can you maybe say a little bit about why it might be important for non-Indigenous children to learn Indigenous languages as well? How does that help, or why are we teaching Indigenous languages to non-Indigenous children too?
Well, non-Indigenous people need to understand, well, they also speak a language, maybe not from this country. So when they come here, they should try to learn some of the languages that are here in the Northwest Territories or anywhere in Canada, because we have nowhere to go to learn our language once it's gone. But that's why we need to keep learning it and passing it on, so that, and if we pass it on to non-Indigenous people, that's a bonus. They already speak probably 2 or 3 languages. What's one more? And they can help us retain the language.
Yeah, the more people speaking the languages, the more people that we have to speak them to, right? And probably it must help understand a little bit more about how the different Indigenous peoples see the world, how they understand and engage with the world, right? It shows some of that insight and understanding how to learn more about one another.
Yeah. I see on Facebook a lot that people, when I'm on there once in a while, that a lot of people are trying to learn their own language, and they're calling each other by certain endearments like Annie, which means friend in English, which is a very loose term, friend. But in the Dene language, it actually means one who is one with me, one who makes me whole. But in English, it's very loose, it's friend.
Oh, I love that. Can you say the term one more time?
Annie.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I think we're just about out of time. And just again, thank you, Sheila, for joining us, for all the work that you do to support Dene languages and Indigenous languages in Yellowknife and in the Northwest Territories. And thank you for joining us today. And thank you to all of the classrooms for coming to this session. And we hope you enjoy the rest of the week. Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me. And I hope I answered everyone's questions.
Thank you.